So, are you ready for our next talk? I will hereby introduce to you Alexander Lichter. Yeah. There he is.
Hey everyone.
What's up, man? I haven't seen you in a while.
Yeah, same. How are you
Same,
doing?
same. That means it's good. And also, this is your third time speaking at this conference. Wow.
Yeah, every year, 3 times in a row, and I hope there will be a fourth one. So I hope I don't mess it up today.
Nah, you'll be fine. And what I would love that the fourth one is actually again in Verona, so we can have some nice dinner in between talks. And remember last time, man, it was good.
That would be beautiful. Yeah.
Exactly. So you will be talking about Nuxt and the Composition API, and maybe
Exactly.
Nuxt 3, but I'll ask you about that later, as you do. And so you're like a Nuxt core maintainer now, right?
Exactly. Yeah, since 2018 actually. So for quite a while now.
Oh, cool. Yeah, because to me it was like, is he in the team? Is he not? But I know you're working with it. It was kind of.
So
Anyways.
I'm not part of the company like
Mhm.
Puya and Daniel and Alex Sebastian, of course. So I'm
Yeah.
like the community part, but I'm still a core maintainer. I'm working right now. I did a couple of PRs to Nitro, if you know about Nitro.
Yeah, sure.
So
I have my fancy hat, so I'm supposed to know.
True.
No, so dude, this is awesome. Thank you very much. And I read in a bit of the information we have about you that you are actually a piano player. And so I cannot wait to make this really fun pun because you're going to be talking about composition. So let's make that piano thing happen and sit back and relax, everybody, because here is Alexander's talk. Cheers. See you in a sec.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining and welcome to my talk about Nuxt.js and the Composition API. So a few words about me before we get started. I'm Alex. I am a Nuxt.js core maintainer, and I also have a Twitter handle, so feel free to follow me. Of course, I'll post about Nuxt and Vue and whatever all the time, if I do, right? And I'm also blogging, so they're the more detailed articles then. Also front-end related stuff, but also functional programming, SEO, refactoring, clean code, you name it. So yeah, feel free to check it out. And I'm working as a web development consultant. Of course, front-end related mostly, Vue and Nuxt as a focus on my own company called Development. Okay, before we get started, let's just take a look at the status quo in general regarding the whole Composition API topic. And at first, Vue 3 is out for a while. That means also the Composition API or C API, however you want to name it, is also out for more than half a year now. Yeah, but the Composition API is out and the ecosystem is still catching up because that takes some time, right? Good news is that more libraries provide composables or have been providing composables for quite some time, like Vue Apollo, Vue ITN, also official, quote unquote, official libraries like Vue Router, Vuex. So that's pretty cool. And the Composition API has been backported to Vue 2 as a plugin. And there are also plans to move this plugin into the core of Vue 2 so that you don't have to register a plugin anymore, and you can just use it. So that's a really cool endeavor, and this is still so there's no OPPR, still discussions, work in progress, but that would be super cool. And good news is that Vue 2 plus Composition API is a viable option because that Composition API backport plugin is quite mature now. It's not considered experimental anymore, and it's working like a charm. Of course, you have this reactivity caveats that Vue 2 has, but that's not a problem of the Composition API. So yeah, it's a viable option. And let's take a look at the goals of the Vue 2 Composition API. I just took them from the README actually, and it was saying that the primary goal is to provide a way to experiment with the API and to collect feedback. And I think giving feedback is still very important. but it was even more important during the whole RFC phase when things were still subject to change and people were trying out and figuring out how to do things the best way. So that was a very important goal, but I think right now the focus shifts more to make the API available. Of course, still experiment, see are there things breaking, and of course give feedback, especially in relation with Vue 2. And I think the second one is also quite important because at some point you want to make migration to Vue 3 easier. So ideally the code will just work, maybe some minor changes, but that's something you should never underestimate, and also an important goal here. So yeah, the good thing is right now you can just take the Vue 2 plugin and install it even with Nuxt. So you can use it. You can already use the Composition API in Nuxt. It works fine, all good. Can be enabled through a Nuxt plugin. And yeah, that's it. So that's my talk. Not just kidding. I wouldn't make a whole talk about it if there weren't some issues about that. I don't necessarily want to call them problems because there's nothing wrong with that approach. But there's still potential that should be used, because of course it's a Vue Composition API plugin. It does not cover Nuxt functionalities. So I did this a couple of times back in time where I installed that plugin, and at some point where I used fetch or async data, I was like, damn, I can't use that in that component, or I can't use that for that specific functionality. Also, the whole SSR topic is quite important because this is something that the Composition API doesn't really focus on. What is with SSR, how to use composable server-side rendering. And that's where the Nuxt.js Composition API comes into place. So the Nuxt Composition API is a superset of the Vue Composition API. So it takes all of it and just sits on top. It, of course, contains composables for Nuxt-specific functionalities, especially like data fetching, accessing the contacts, receiving the current route, or like setting meta tags and so on. And you will see this also in a bit. And also good news, it's under the Nuxt community umbrella. Right now it's maintained by Daniel Rowe. Thanks, Daniel, for your hard work. So this is also another good sign. Yeah, and let's take a look at the goals here as well, because they're quite similar to the Vue Composition API package goals. The first one is to provide a way to use the Composition API with Nuxt and Vue 2. So just being able to use it, ideally with almost no limitations. And of course, the second goal is get feedback for future composables. So just get ideas. Again, you can experiment with the API, and if you think, I have to build this specific composables in almost all my projects on my own, maybe we could include it in the core. Maybe other problems have that issue as well. So yeah, feedback is very important here. Also, like figuring out how to use composables with server-side rendering in SSR framework. And the third goal is that we want to make future migration to Nuxt 3 easier, of course. Talking about that, as an information, the API of these Nuxt-specific composables will likely change before Nuxt 3 is released, because we want to align them, want to make migration easier. So expect at some point that things will change a little bit more than usual. Yeah, and talking about Nuxt 3, so there is a release plan now. So Q1, private alpha. Q2 public beta, yeah, this will be pretty cool, coming soon. I mean, Q2 is not that far away. I mean, actually, we're in Q2, so the public beta might not be that far away. And so throughout the year, at some point, RCs, stable releases, and so on, helping the ecosystem to prepare to catch up and so on. So yeah, this will be pretty cool. Stay tuned. But well, that's it. From Nuxt 3 perspective, let's talk about the Composition API and common composables. And before we start with the first composable, let's start with how fetch in Nuxt works. Because if you have never used it, I'll show you. So these are 12 lines of a script part of component. In the first one, we import Axios, of course, and then we have our data. As usual, we set mountains to an empty array, and then in line 9 to 11, we have this async fetch block, and we just say set this.mountains to whatever the result of that promise of that Axios call is. Yeah, and that's it. And good news is, if you use server-side rendering, if that's called on server, the promise will be awaited. So that means that the data will be in the HTML, all good. On the client side, it won't be awaited. So That means the page will render and then at some point the content will appear. Means best of both worlds. Nice. And let's see how useFetch works, the Composition API implementation of that. And it's kind of similar to the fetch method of Nuxt, of course. So we start with line 1 here, and we import define component, ref, and useFetch from the Nuxt Composition API. Okay, if you think about if you have used the Vue Composition API, you see, well, ref is also present there and define component as well. So why should we import it from Nuxt.js Composition API? The reason is for ref, because of convenience, Nuxt is just re-exporting that, so like ref, computed, all of it. And define component, well, we use the method to, of course, improve the type completion is already there, and also to create a few workarounds for things like Vue meta, which you will see in a bit. So definitely, especially for define component, import them from the Composition API Nuxt package. Okay, then we have our setup function, and in line 6, we initialize mountains to a reactive reference with a default value of an empty array. So similar like the data part, I decided to use ref here because I like ref and it's more explicit, but you can also use reactive or whatever. In this case, just one variable, I would go for ref. And now in useFetch, what are we doing? We have again an async function. So this might look a bit similar to the last slide where you also had an async fetch function. And instead of setting this.mountains to the result of the Axios call, we set mountains.value because it's a reactive reference. In the Composition API, we don't have any this anymore. Yeah, so this is it. And then we return mountains, of course, to use it in template. And that's the whole trick. It looks quite similar, also works quite similar, but now inside the setup function. Cool. And now maybe if you've used fetch a few times, you wonder, can I use fetch state in the template now? Or do I have to, how do I get that? Do I have to return it? And can I refetch data? And the good news is yes to all of, well, yes to most of it. So you can use fetch and fetch state inside your setup function because these will just be returned from useFetch. Super cool. If you don't need it, don't worry, just don't get them. If you want them, go ahead. And you see, we don't pass them to the return function. It's also mentioned in the comment because the template already knows about $fetch and $fetch state. So if you use them in your setup function, go ahead, get them, use them. If you use them in a template, they're already there. Cool. Nice. Now, yeah, let's talk about the context. The context, again, is available throughout Nuxt.js in various scenarios. In async data, in a plugin function, in middleware, in Nuxt server init, and so on. So as an example here with async data, another way to fetch data in Nuxt, you can get, for example, the parameters through the context, the route, your modules with in line 4 context or $axios, and you can also get the store and dispatch actions here. The context is especially important if there's no this. So for example, in async data, which is being called before the component is even initialized, there is no this because there's no component. That's why the context is pretty important here. So yeah, that just as an information because we want to get a few things we usually get through the context now through composables. If you use fetch, of course, you could use like this.$axios or this.route and so on. Yeah. And the first two composables are useRoute and useRouter. That's yeah, mostly similar to the Vue router composables. Besides, in this case, they return refs and not reactives. So we have to use route.value and not just route due to reactivity. But it's very closely aligned to how the whole Vue router composables work. So what we do in our setup function is, again, const route equals use route, and then we can use a computer property to get the ID parameter from our URL. So yeah, that's pretty similar to the Vue free router composables, I'd say. And also the define, the use router option is also there to use router push, router replace, and so on. So that works quite well too. And then we have use store. which is another composable, again, closely aligned to the vuex composable. In here, no problem, you get the store by use uStore. In past versions of the Composition API, you could get all these through useContext, which we'll talk about it in a bit. But ideally, you use these dedicated composables to be, well, I'd say kind of more future-proof and aligned with what will happen in the future. Also, you can now type your store easier through this uStore composable. So for example, if you define interface and then either use that as a type declaration behind uStore, or if you say you pass a key, so some kind of symbol, which is an injection key, inside your uStore function, then your store is typed, or yeah, better typed. Again, it's for TypeScript users, and typing vuex ain't that easy always, so that might be a cool method for you. And now, as I mentioned, for all other things, you can use useContext, because you can get your modules, for example, from useContext. You could also use a wrapper function. That's all explained in docs, but useContext is also a legit way here. Again, I would suggest not to get like routes, store, and so on, but use dedicated composables. But for example, you can get the HTTP module if you've registered before in your Nuxt config through the context and then do some calls. Of course, in this case, they won't do that much because in the setup functions, there shouldn't be any async calls, but I think you catch the drift here. And then we have useAsync. UseAsync is another way to fetch data, and similar to async data and fetch, there are two ways to fetch data there. So we have also another way to fetch data in the Composition API. It is kind of close to async data, but there are also differences. But let's take a look at the whole thing first. Inside here, we get our HTTP module from useContext, and then we say, okay, use async, and then we have an async function that just returns the value of HTTP get. And then instead of mutating some reactive reference or something, we just assign the result of useAsync to posts in this case. And as the comment line 7 says, post will be a ref with the value null at first, and as soon as the promise, or in this case this HTTP call, is being resolved and the result is there, that ref will be populated with the value. So not at first, and at some point it gets the value. But there are a few differences here, especially when we use SSR, because on the server side again, the server will wait. So we have a request to the node server, and the node server will do this useAsync call to some API. There will be a response, and the node server is waiting for that. So the HTML and JavaScript will include the response, and the templates will include the real values for the useAsync call. So for example, all your blog posts. That means for the initial request, useAsync is only called on the server side. It's not called on the client side again, gets the values, all good. On the client side, for example, if you navigate from page A to page B, then we have this scenario where posts might be null, or is null. So it's null, useAsync is called, request to the API, posts, as soon as the call succeeded, has a value, and that's it. Important difference here to async data, there won't be any blocking navigation. So the site will be rendered, the content will appear. If you use async data, the site will wait for the result, leading in some breaks or some waiting time. Yeah, but that's the main difference here. So it's not the exact equivalent of async data. We have some similarities, like both are blocking on the server side, both can be executed on server and client side, and there is no way to refetch data built in. You can of course refetch data, but useFetch, for example, has fetch or fetch state for state checking. That's nothing built in directly, but it's difficult to do. And there are some differences between async data, so the options API style, and useAsync. Useasync is non-blocking on the client side, while async data is blocking, which I've explained a minute before. And of course, data from useasync is not merged with data because there is no data in the Composition API. Okay, and then we have useStatic. useStatic is some cool idea. for like expensive functions and static site generation. The idea is to run these functions only during the build time. Okay, so what do we have here? We get our params from use context. Again, please use route here, not use context. But in theory, this will compile, right? Then we get our slug by using the params, and then we say const beer equals use static. And now we have a function. So the first argument, then we pass in the second, the third argument. So the function is the factory. That's the async function that will populate the ref that this function returns. So again, similar to use async, this function returns a ref. Important is here that this function will receive the parameter and the key base. So these are argument 2 and 3. So in this case, the slug, and 3 the key base beers. It can use both. It can use one of them as you like. You can define a function. Yeah. And I've noticed down here, the second one is the parameter, which is some kind of an optional parameter like an ID to distinguish multiple API fetch calls using the same factory function. So you want to get some specific beer, and if it's the same, then we don't have to do it twice or thrice. But if it's different, we want to do a call again, of course. And then we have the key base that should be unique across projects. So this is really important because, again, to differentiate between calls. If it's not provided, this will be auto-generated, but ideally you want to provide that. Okay, so if you still have no idea what is happening, no problem. We will go for it in detail. During the generation, by using like yarn generate, that factory function 1 will be executed, and it gets 2 and 3 as parameters. In here we only use 2. We use that slug, and it will do that API call, and the result of the API call will be saved as JSON, named by the parameter. So by 2, and by the key base 3. So when, for example, the slug would be Sternburg, then that file would be saved under /static/beers, because it's our third parameter, dash Sternburg, second slug, right? In the dist folder. Okay, so this will be saved during generation, and when your site is live at some point and this file is needed, what's happening is that the browser requests that static JSON file, and there will be the response. Cool. And during client side, it's similar. Get the JSON, and it will return. It will be returned, and it will be cached. So that's pretty cool. But if for whatever reason that call fails, then the factory function will be running on client side again. So there will never be a failure. Worst case, there just will be re-execution and longer wait time. Okay. So let's take a look at some other composable, which is called onGlobalSetup. It's quite useful to have some global injects to vueday. So via provide inject. Great place for like global layout dependent composables. You can also just put them in Nuxt plugins where onGlobalSetup is also used. And one example is to provide some kind of default Apollo client here. Yeah. Okay. We will use onGlobalSetup and as well as the next composable and example. And the next one is use meta. So yeah. What is very important is that we can also alter metadata. One of the coolest features of Nuxt to define like title, meta text, and so on. And in here, it's very important that your component must be defined through this define component part exported by Nuxt.js Composition API, because there is some reactivity workaround. And also you need an empty head top level key. So in here line 5, you see head empty object. This has to exist, otherwise it won't work. Yeah, so the first way is we can use meta and just pass in some initial data. Nice. Another way is we can also get refs. For example, we get the title and say title.value equals some value, and it will change. So we can also get reactivity in here. And another option is to say, okay, we have some kind of computed meta property or computed meta. So we say we define a ref, we say use meta, put in a function, and then we can change the ref used in this function, and similar to a computed property, dependency tracking will work and the metadata will update. So these are 3 ways to use that. However they come in handy, just give them a try. Also, global usage is possible. And now let's just build our own composable. Canonical links. Cool topic, SEO. If you don't know what canonical links are, short summary in here. Ideally, every site should have a canonical link pointing to our own site and to the specific version. So say www. whatever or non-www in front, and should have a trailing slash or no. Ideally, it has no query parameters except they're important for, well, accessing the site and so on. I've also given a talk about SEO in Vue.js where I talked about all these properties in detail last year here also at the vueday, so feel free to check that out. Yeah, so important for SEO, important to avoid duplicate content, and these are the preferred URL. And let's see how we can implement that. So I've built a first composable called useCurrentURL. And what's happening is I get the public runtime config, or the $config in this case, from the context, and I get the route by using useRoute. Okay, now I get the base URL out of the config because somehow I want to save the base URL. I just don't want to read them out from window because we can also be in server and it should be predefined. So I've saved them in the public runtime config, which is a cool Nuxt feature where you can save like env variables, but change them on each deploy, like how env variables usually work. Yeah, and in this case, I just say use the base URL and combine it with the current path. So just say get me the full URL. Nice. And now this is a bit larger, but be with me. Use Canonical. So, well, it takes, and this is all JavaScript, right? At first it takes a link parameter, and this will be a ref, and this will be important later. Then we get the current URL by using use current URL. And then we have our first computed called URL with slash. So what is happening in here? Well, we get the value of the current URL because use current URL, again, we've seen that before, returns a computed. And then we say, does the URL end with a slash? If so, we don't have to add anything. If it's not ending with a slash, then, well, add a slash, add a trailing slash. It's just my personal preference. Then we just stick them together. That's it. Yeah, and then we get the canonical link index. And there the link argument comes in handy. It's a computed property, and we just check, does that link ref that contains an array has some element in there where rel equals canonical. And you will see how this will be important a bit. Then we have remove link if exists. Another function, won't be called, just simple function. And we say in this function, if there is a canonical link index, then we have to remove it, otherwise don't do anything. And last but not least, we watch the current URL, and every time it changes, we call remove link if exists, and then we push our new canonical link, which has an href value of URL with slash. So we always say on route change, just set up the new canonical URL by adding the current URL with a trailing slash. Of course, we could like strip parameters and stuff, but that's too much for the sake of example. And neat little hint that last option part in that watch function, immediate true, is cool because we execute it immediately. Okay, so, and then we have our next plugin, and we say on global setup, const link equals use meta. So here we get our link array or ref containing that array from use meta, and we pass it in use canonical. And that's it. So we've just built a composable that, well, is separated into more composables that also can be reused. For example, getting the current full URL is quite important every now and then. And yeah, we can easily set our composable, our canonical link without doing anything. Cool. So this is also used in action in some of my pages, if I recall correctly. So yeah, must be. And now we've talked a bit about refs, and there are also new refs. So we have an SSR ref, a reactive reference with SSR in mind. This SSR ref is pretty cool because state from the server needs to be transferred at some point from the server to the client. right? We need to somehow tell the client what the server state is or was. And SSRF will do it automatically, so you don't have to change anything. So for example, if we take this very basic example, get it SSRF, set from equals SSRF empty string, set from dot value. If it's called on the server, set it to server. It's on the client, set it to client. Nice. Then if you, in the initial request, it will be server, and on client side it will be client. So hydration will happen. Server state will be copied over. Also, like many composables use SSRFs under the hood. Many Nuxt.js composables. And it also accepts a setter function. So if you have some expensive setter function, you can just pass it in. Another cool feature. And of course, there are way more. So there's like shallow SSRF, which is a combination of shallow ref and SSRF. There's regref, a ref that resets itself per request. We also have a reg SSRF, which is a combination of regref and SSRF, and so on. So check them out in the docs. Yeah, feel free to use them if you can use them, or if you need to. Okay. And last but not least, some gotchas, because some helpers, as I said, SSRF, use async, for example, as well. SSR promise, never mentioned it here, and shallow SSRF, they're using keys under the hood for serialization. Because again, server state to client, somehow it has to be transferred, and you have to create some kind of mapping. The problem is when you use them in global composables, you have to put in a key. Otherwise, there will be mismatches and issues. So let's take a look how this would look like. Let's say we have a function called useGetFancyResult, and we don't pass in any key to the SSRF. So we set result equals SSRF empty string, and at some point we return the result. Okay, cool. Now, globally, we use them in several other places, say const A equals useGetFancyResult and const B. And now we set the value of B to 00. Then, because there is no key passed in, A will also have the same value of 00. Not good. And why? Because they use the same key internally. If you don't pass a key, Babel will insert a key. But of course, it won't insert a key per call, because it's not what Babel is doing. Babel is the Babel plugin is changing the code, so it will only be inserted in the function call. So every time you call the function, the SSRF will be changed for the same key, and then things will break. So how to change that? Well, not a problem. We can pass in a key as a second parameter. And in this case, we just say useGetFancyResult A and useGetFancyResult B. Not an issue. Of course, if you use them globally in your app, you maybe not want to use A and B. Also, similar reason for passing in a key to use static, which we've seen before. All right, let's sum it up, I would say. So first of all, Nuxt Composition API, yeah, it is a thing. It provides us specific functions, and it gives lots of space to build your own composables, to go crazy with it. And in my opinion, you should give it a try. I might be biased here, but yeah, just try it out and see if it works for you. If you have any question, there will be a Q&A after the next slide. So thanks a lot for joining, and I hope you will use the Nuxt Composition API. If so, please just write me how it works. If it doesn't work, tell me, and if you like it as well. So yeah, see you in the Q&A. Thanks a lot, and have a nice day, of course.
Hello, he's back. How was that, watching yourself back in a recorded video?
Actually quite normal, because I usually rewatch my talks before submitting.
Yes, of course.
I know, like, I did it so often, especially like, hearing my own voice, so I kind of got used to it. At first, it's always awkward, like, oh, is it really me? But I mean, I've recorded in studios before and stuff, because I did some musical things in my youth.
Yeah,
so I'm used to that.
Yeah, well, dude, it was inspirational, because I haven't seen much of the Composition API in Nuxt. All I know is how Vue Storefront does it, but I kind of just take it on the cheek and run it, and it works, but I never went deep. And the stuff that you were showing, whoa, I cannot wait to get started, to be honest. I'm going to rebuild my website with Nuxt, of course, but there's no Nuxt 3. So I'm going to do it with Nuxt2 in this.
Yeah, then migrating when Nuxt2
Exactly.
does.
Yeah, because one of my questions is, imagine we use the Nuxt Composition API. We do everything correctly. When Nuxt3 comes along, does it just work or do we need to change some stuff?
So, I mean, ideally, most of the things will just work. But as I mentioned before, the Composition API package itself will likely change bigger than it is right now, because
Okay.
while experimenting with Nuxt 3, more ideas, more composables come into mind, and then we try to
Of
backport them
course.
into that module so people can use them. And then
Yeah.
ideally, there's
Are you still here, Alexander?
oh, can't you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, you're back. I apologize.
Sorry. Yeah, I mentioned, like, for example, the use router thing. It's closely
Mhm.
aligned to view router 4, but we have to use refs due to reactivity caveats. So there may be a
Exactly.
few things, but it's I think it will make migration easier. I can't promise that nothing will break. That also depends on your application, but
Of
it
course.
will be smooth.
Yeah, knowing me, it's going to be a bit strange, but I like to experiment. So let's have a look. There's a bunch of questions in the chat. Let's go with those first, and then let's see if we have some time left for my own. So let's start with Sibrin again. So at what lifecycle hook is the useFetch function called?
Right. So the useFetch function, or in this case, like the normal fetch, is called after created. So I just paste that link in the chat for the Nuxt2 lifecycle docs.
Okay, cool.
So everybody can reread the whole process when it's called what. There's like a neat diagram there. So yeah.
Cool. Next from Samuel. Is or will the use async work with SSR and SSG?
Yes, this works out of the box. Important, if you don't
Nice.
specify your own key, like I mentioned, this is only suitable for one-offs. So if you want to use it like more often, then you have to specify your own key. But besides that, it will work with SSG and SSR.
Nice. Oh, there's so many questions. Next from Elise. Is there an equivalent of use static in the standard Nuxt? I'm assuming Nuxt2.
Yes, so I would so as a standalone function, not, but it's kind of similar to full static mode, where we also say we take the result of like fetch JSON data, save them in a payload. It's no JSON, it's like JSONP, I think, and we will take it in then. So this is kind of similar, but no standalone function like useStatic offers now.
Okay. And so again, from Elise, the same question, but with SSR ref.
For SSRF, no, I'm not aware that there's a similar functionality.
No, that's what I thought also. So, like my own website right now is completely static. I enjoy the Jamstack thing, and I actually in my bundle to the client side, I don't want any JavaScript unless it's needed. Do I just use the use static composable? Is that the best approach here?
Well, it's a bit tough because you still kind of need JavaScript, of course, to fetch all that stuff.
Of course.
I think, I mean, you're already good with the whole full static part, so you don't need to have API calls again. I think you can try to optimize that with use static there, but I'm not sure if it gives you like large benefits there. But I guess it's trying out the measuring there.
Yeah, I'm just gonna have to see and figure it out, because I saw you have so many composables that I all kind of need to start understanding and then use. But that's gonna be great. So let me see what I have left. So using this composition API component kind of thing, do you feel for now that this is ready for production of large scale projects?
Yeah, so this is always a tough question.
I know,
say
that's why I'm asking.
people ask me it quite often, and I
Oh,
would
really?
say
Cool.
yes, especially where I'm in projects doing consulting. Like, okay, it's a 0 point something package. Is it okay to use? I would say it depends on what you want to use. Of course, there can be breakage, but at first you want to pin the dependency, of course, if it's in a real world production use, and then it's like you can use something like use static there, and you can try it out. You see if it works fine. As usual with some package, there at some point there might be bugs, obviously. So I would say you can use things like use fetch, which is very closely aligned to Nuxt fetch without problems.
Exactly. So it's pretty safe. Yeah, I would probably go there. Yeah.
I think it's like more exotic. Like, try it out, but handle with care. You can always fall back to for something like use fetch, or also build your own composables. And the good thing is, everything from that the Nuxt.js package re-exports from the Vue Composition API is good to use anyway.
Yeah, and so recently I used a bunch of Vue storefront, right? And they're running on Nuxt with your plugin, and so they use this on SSR composable. Is that something that they built, or is this something that comes from your library?
So that's a good question. I'm not aware of that on SSR composable. I have to look that up, and I will answer that in the chat later, I would say.
Yeah, and
But
based on
so
what I saw from you, oh, sorry, go on, go on.
it could be that, of course, there are like some underlying functions used, and you can kind of figure out if you're using SR, for example. But it sounds like safe split in the first point here.
Yeah, I think it's basically on async data, something like that.
Would make sense, yeah.
The only thing is they do it slightly differently, which is kind of interesting to me. There's like they load the composable on SSR, and they have it's basically what you show. Like it's curly bracket open. It's like the content as a variable, and then there's a search function.
Mhm.
And so you can fire the search function, and the content variable is filled, and then it returns. It's basically a React hook kind of thing. It's like the use static, or now how do you call it? It's like use status or something like that. And you know what? In Vue Storefront, it really works. But
I can
I'm also
imagine.
scared going live with this at huge scale because it's kind of black magic as well. But this is part of the game in our world, I guess.
Yeah, frameworks always come with some magic. The good thing is it's all open source, and you know if there are other people that experience bugs and stuff. So of course I use it in lots of projects, and
Mhm.
I can't spoil too much there. But I also have some
Yeah.
clients that will use it in production.
Yeah.
Of course with care, but they do.
I'll be one of those. So last
Nice.
question, because we have like 2-3 minutes left until we go to our next talk. So the Nuxt Composition API, it seems like it would be great to use with TypeScript, but we're also in Nuxt 2. How does that combine with TypeScript? Are you happily using that, or is it a little sketchy?
So I'm not a huge TypeScript user, but I use it
Mhm.
more and more. And with the Composition API, just plain Vue, it works super well, and with Nuxt as well. So this is real beneficial if you TypeScript user, because there are almost no issues. And of course, for
Nice.
example, if you want to use some custom modules that register something in the global context, you have to add a few types in there. But besides
Yes.
that, go for it. It's worth it.
Okay. So same question as to Anthony: types or interfaces?
That's a
It's an
philosophical
annoying
question.
question. I know.
To me it's like I don't mind whatever works for the project. If I work with people, say like let's go on types, okay, interfaces, I don't mind. Personally,
Yeah.
I'm mixing these quite often, to be fair. So
Okay. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
best
Sure.
practice, I guess, but well.
You know what? In TypeScript, I still don't know what best practices are because I'm still quite new to it. So, but my new website will have this Nuxt API you just talked about. It will have TypeScript. I'm just going to go full force ahead, and I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions.
Yeah, I mean, we can also do a stream or something if you're interested in that.
Oh, we
So
shall. Maybe that would be actually a pretty good one. And so, last question before we move on. What is your favorite composable?
my favorite composable. That's actually tough. I think it's not like the favorite use and so on. I think just the whole concept of refs is pretty cool.
Yes.
That you don't have to care about like dependency tracking anymore, no matter how deeply nested objects are and so on. That's super.
Yeah, exactly. That's great. So thank you. So go on.
More, sorry, I have one more just small note. So for everyone who just followed the talk and does not know much about Nuxt, but is maybe interested, as mentioned beforehand, there will be a workshop coming soon. I'll just post the link in the chat. So if you're interested in that, if you don't have that much experience with Nuxt, or are a beginner, then go ahead and maybe we'll see each other in a week. Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be a great workshop. I cannot wait to see that. Hereby, Alexander, we will do a stream, and we will set that up in the coming weeks.
Perfect.
Ready for that. All right. So thank you very much for your talk. And I will hereby thank you and see you soon. Cheers.
See you. Bye-bye.